From extreme vetting to going nuclear, Senator Gary Peters on the tumultuous dawn of the Trump era. And the contentious issues just keep coming. We'll try to tackle them all today, Sunday, February 5th, 2017. And this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. Another week into the Trump presidency, and there seems to be no leavening just yet, no slowing of the pace of news and developments that are still often jarring. After months of hearing Donald Trump talking about forging a new, friendlier relationship with Russia, his new ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, delivers a stern rebuke at Russia over events in the Crimea. After months of supportive talk for Israel and considering moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, the president suddenly suggested that new settlements might not be helpful toward Mideast peace. Perhaps no surprise that he would have a testy phone call with the president of Mexico, but with the Prime Minister of Australia? The president basically said we'd better get used to seeing toughness from this White House. Well, how tough does he want to get with Iran, which was worrisomely busy with missile testing, leading the president to tell Iran that they are now on notice? Now, these are all terribly serious issues, but once again, competing for news space with wackiness. This time it was a tit-for-tat between the president and Arnold Schwarzenegger over the falling ratings on The Apprentice television show. Have you got this new abnormal figured out yet? I've talked to a number of Trump supporters who've liked just about all of it. To their way of thinking, a kept promise to completely upset the rotten apple cart of the Washington system. Others worry that sooner or later, the matches are going to get too close to all of this flammable material. Up first this morning, we're going to talk with Michigan Senator Gary Peters about the stakes for our state. And then our roundtable gets their turn as well. It's a busy morning today on Flashpoint. We've talked quite a bit about the reach of the early stages of the Trump presidency into Michigan, between trade policy, meetings with automakers, immigration decisions, and a prominent Michigander as a nominee for education secretary. Let's talk about all that with Michigan Democratic Senator Gary Peters. Very good to have you here, Senator. Thank you very much for coming.
Always great to be with you, Devin.
Give me a thumbnail on your take on what these first 2 weeks have been like in the nation's capital.
Well, obviously been busy, but all over. It's just so hard to predict what's going to happen. It looks as if the Trump administration moves forward without vetting certain actions that they're taking. Certainly we saw what happened with the travel ban and the immigration order, which caused so much chaos, particularly here and with our Arab Muslim American community. It appears as if he didn't talk to the Department of Homeland Security or other agencies beforehand, put this out, and caused all sorts of problems.
Now, his supporters would say that the reason that you and your colleagues, and frankly those of us in the media, are so stunned by what we're seeing is we've just gotten so not used to seeing decisiveness in Washington, that we're also not used to seeing somebody who actually does what they promised they would do on the campaign trail. These are the consequences of an election, and just the first time that many of you have seen somebody who really knows what they're doing and starts delivering immediately.
Well, that's where I would take exception. This is really about reckless behavior. This is not about knowing what you're doing. When you look at the immigration issue, for example, where you had folks who got on an airplane thinking that they were completely legal, could come here as a part of the refugee program, and were excited with their families. And when they land, the United States government had suddenly changed the rules while they were in the air. The repercussions of that throughout the community, which were pretty significant here, that's irresponsible. That's not about taking an action. That's not about thinking through the consequences of what you are engaged in. And in fact, related to that, we had a meeting with the Armed Services Committee, which I am on. Yep. We had a discussion about what's happening in Syria, in Iraq. In fact, Senator McCain asked them, is this making us safer? And the view of the experts was, no, this is now actually going to make it more difficult for us to deal with ISIS.
I want to get to the military as well, since you're on the committee. But before we do that, there have been a number of videos making the rounds now, though, that show similar tough talk about immigration from both President Obama and even as far back as President Clinton, saying the same kind of things, that we've got bad folks coming in, that our immigration policy is broken. And I guess the suggestion behind these videos is that for some reason we're not willing to invest President Trump with the authority that he rightfully won.
Well, I think no one's arguing we shouldn't have secure borders. You know, I think about this every day. I sit on the Homeland Security Committee in addition to Armed Services. National security is something that is first and foremost. The role of federal government is to keep us safe. So we have to be strong. We have to have secure borders. There's no question about that. but you also have to do it in a thoughtful way.
Back to armed services, we saw this operation in Yemen which claimed the life of an American serviceman, and I think some have suggested that some of the things that we might have seen in the Obama administration handled by drone, as controversial as that was, by drone policy, that now we might see more bodies, more men and women on the ground, boots on the ground as the phrase goes. Is that where you think we're headed in this war on terror?
Well, I hope not, but obviously it depends on the circumstances. It depends on what the mission may be, but whenever you put boots on the ground, obviously the risks go up dramatically, not just for the service members who are there, but then if something goes wrong and you need to get them out, you tend to bring in a lot more firepower to do that, and you can have a lot of collateral damage with civilians and others, which we saw in this case. So, those are ones that have to be vetted very, very carefully before you execute those missions. Obviously things happen, you can't control it. These are complex, highly dangerous missions that you put men and women in. I just hope that President Trump understands the danger and is very careful before he puts men and Americans into harm's way.
What do you think it means to tell Iran that they're on notice, and how dangerous is that situation getting? We're watching ballistic missile testing by Iran.
Yeah, well, it is dangerous, and I'm not sure what on notice actually means and how that is defined. But certainly I'm troubled by ballistic testing that's going on. That needs to be treated. We need to be aggressive, and the Iranians need to know that we're not going to tolerate that. That creates a security risk throughout the Middle East, which is simply unacceptable. As I mentioned at the top of the program, we saw a couple things this past week where there was almost a move or a remaining in alignment with Obama administration policy. We saw Nikki Haley take issue with the Russians for what's going on in the Crimea there in front of the UN Security Council. We also saw a statement not exactly against increasing settlements in Israel, but saying that's not helpful toward Mideast peace. Did you find comfort in that was seemed to be stepping back from what some have seen as hyperbolic talk during the campaign? And I don't know. I think it's too early to know, because we have to hear from President Trump as to where he's coming from. Certainly, when it comes to Russia, I have had very serious concerns about the talk coming out of President Trump and his accolades for Putin. Putin is not a friend of the United States. The fact that they illegally went into Crimea, they have folks killing Ukrainians on the Eastern Front now. In the summer, I was in Ukraine, I was in Estonia, two countries that are extremely fearful of the Russians and the aggression that we have been seeing from the Russians. These are allies that were looking to the United States to stay strong against Russia, and to have this apparently cozy relationship that Trump is trying to have with Mr. Putin, I think is very dangerous.
I mentioned also, in fact, this past Friday, you were called into a meeting at 6:30 a.m. For a procedural vote on moving forward the nomination of Betsy DeVos. I think some would say, look, this is a Michigander who's up, somebody who understands what's going on in our state. You've made it pretty clear that this is a Michigander that you can't support.
Well, it is, and it's just based on the facts. In the fact, I just don't believe that she has the experience. She doesn't have the qualifications to be the Secretary of Education. I've been able to see her work firsthand, part of being in Michigan, and her move to have vouchers to transfer taxpayer money into private schools, which we can't be weakening our public schools. We need to be strengthening our public schools. The move to charters in a way that didn't have proper accountability. If you talk to charter school advocates around the country, they will tell you Michigan is not a good example to be followed by the rest of the country.
We see this, though, every transition. We see this intransigence by the party that lost, by the party that tries to control what they can if they can't control the White House, and that we're reminded that elections have consequences, and the person who won that office should probably be able to surround themselves with the people who can carry out their wishes, and that a lot of this fighting that we see every time over a cabinet really doesn't square with what we just saw happen on Election Day.
Well, I think the process needs to be open. You need to have vigorous debate. The American people need to see these cabinet officials. They're going to have a significant impact on policy. But I agree. I mean, I supported General Mattis. Yes. I voted for him. I voted for Secretary Kelly of Homeland Security, Elaine Chao for Secretary of Transportation. So there are a number of folks who I believe, although I may not agree with everything that some folks may say, I do believe that they are experienced. They have the knowledge, and in some cases, like General diplomatist. I think he'll be a countervailing force to what I see problems with President Trump. I think he'll make an excellent Secretary of Defense. So I support those candidates, but the American people should have an opportunity to see these folks and hear the answers to the questions that are asked.
Well, then, as we move forward now on a Supreme Court nomination, do you see tit for tat? Do you want to see the same intransigence? You couldn't, President Obama's choice, Merrick Garland, wouldn't get through, so now the Democrats will return in kind with their own kind of intransigence on Gorsuch, or should Neil Gorsuch make his way through, because that's the appointment that comes with being president?
Well, as we've seen, the appointment for the Supreme Court should also undergo very vigorous scrutiny.
Yes.
And so that's the way I'm
unanimously got through on his last appointment to the Court of Appeals.
Court of Appeals, but obviously after you've been on the Court of Appeals, you now have a longer record, and people can have a better sense of who you are, what's your judicial philosophy, how you work through these issues. And I'm open-minded. I'm going to let this process go forward. I'm in the process now of reviewing some of his cases, looking at his background. I will listen intently to the answers that he gives to questions from the Judiciary Committee, which I'm not on. But the American people need to have a full opportunity to see this justice as well. Obviously, a Supreme Court appointment is a big deal, and this gentleman could be there for a long time. The American people have the right to have a full airing of his background and his thoughts.
Lastly, what is your biggest concern? What's keeping you awake at night, if anything is, in Washington?
Well, the concern that I'm concerned about is cyber security. I serve on Homeland Security, as I mentioned, armed services. I'm on the Commerce Committee, and you look at the cyber attacks with private business. I think without question, the number one national security risk that we face as a country are cyber attacks. We've seen it from the Russians with the election, but that's just a small part of the type of cyber attacks that the Russians are engaged in. Other countries are involved in these, state actors, highly sophisticated. And given the fact that we are becoming more and more of an interconnected world, and as we move to even more connections with the Internet of Things, that's wonderful, but it also increases your vulnerabilities dramatically. We need to step up our game a whole lot more than we're doing right now.
Senator Gary Peters, you've had a very busy couple of weeks. I appreciate your time this morning. Thanks.
Great to be with you.
You bet. We'll let our roundtable weigh in right after this. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. Welcome back, Flashpoint. Let's bring in this morning's roundtable to continue this conversation. Very happy to have with me Bankley Thompson back, columnist from the Detroit News. Portia Roberson is the Civil Rights Director for the City of Detroit. Randy Richardville is the former Senate Majority Leader in Lansing. And Daniel Howes, business columnist for the Detroit News. Gang, thank you very much for being here. Daniel, I guess I'd like to start with you and your thoughts on the hyperbolic nature of these 2 weeks, which, as Senator Peters says, is what has everybody feeling rather uncomfortable, that it's all too much too fast at once.
It is a lot, and it is fast. What strikes me as we get to the end of the second week, or got to the end of the second week, is how things started to slow down a little bit, and they seem to be getting, there's a lot of talk in the media about the administration kind of retooling after the immigration ban was put out last weekend, and how it was such a mess. And I think at least some people in the White House recognize it's a mess. In foreign policy, you've got some real traditional things that were happening in terms of Russia, Iran, and Israel as well. So I think that there's some attempt to try and kind of dial things back. The Supreme Court nomination in the middle of the week, I thought looked very textbook, felt very textbook in terms of the way it was rolled out.
Except for having one of the candidates drive his way to Washington.
Well, according to the administration, that was not true.
But he wasn't on his way to Washington.
That was another piece of chum that was thrown out there, and people followed it along. And you had cable TV people saying, "Oh, what's going on here? It's just like a beauty contest," and apparently it wasn't true.
Well, but you did have, I think Donald Trump enjoys his drama, and he
no question.
He said as much.
No
And
question. I think one of the things that I keep thinking about is during the auto show when Donald Trump was front and center with a lot of the CEOs, and one of them finally said, I think it was Sergio Marchionne, he was elected president of the United States. We have to adjust. He doesn't have to adjust us. We have to adjust.
Randy, you've been a Donald Trump supporter at times back during the campaign when there were some moments when it probably wasn't comfortable to be so. Have you been comfortable with everything of these couple of weeks, or are there some things that have been worrisome for you?
Well, as far as the actual policies go, I'm very comfortable. I mean, there's nothing new that he didn't talk about during the campaign, so I'm comfortable with the way he's doing things, the fact that he said he's going to move quickly, he's not being political about it. I don't make any apologies, and I don't think he should. I do have a problem, and I've talked about this somewhat candidly before, with some of the tweets and things that he sends out, that the office of the President of the United States should stay away from things like name calling or talking down to people or saying somebody's not sincere with their emotions. I mean, if you want to send out facts and information, I'm okay, but I don't think that's very respectful to that.
Chuck Schumer's tears, I think you're referring to there.
That might be.
Well, then, it might be. As I said, Portia, to Senator Peters, I think some Trump supporters would say, those of you who don't like Donald Trump just don't know what a decisive, determined leader looks like. This is what he promised, and this is what you get.
This is absolutely not what a thoughtful, determined leader looks like. This is crazy at the national level. I mean, this man is, you know, using the National Prayer Breakfast to ask us to pray for Arnold Schwarzenegger because his ratings are bad on Celebrity Apprentice, using time to say that, you know, those ratings need to get better. He cannot let anything go. He uses Twitter to tell us about policy changes. He has not risen to the level of the office of president. And yes, I hear what you're saying about we have to adjust, but one had hoped that when someone got elected president, they would revere the office as all Americans are asked to do. Respect the office as much as you might disagree with the person who's in the office. I don't see our leader respecting the office at all at this point.
Frankly, I think a lot of people assumed, though, Donald Trump was going to have to grow into this, having not been in the world of politics before, and that might include some of the things that Portia's talking about. What are your thoughts?
Look, he'll have to grow into it, but growing into it as President of the United States is a dangerous assessment, and it's a dangerous risk. I think, yes, I understand that he was voted in through the Electoral College, but I think what we're seeing right now is some of the things that he has done is beneath the dignity of the occupant of the White House. Right now, as we speak, Devin, end of this month, the British Parliament is going to debate after 1 million petitions about whether to invite the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, on an official visit to the United Kingdom. That's a very big deal. It's never happened before. And Mexico, the president
would have to vote on it.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
The Mexico now canceling a meeting. I mean, it used to be an incredible honor to have a meeting, an audience with the President of the United States, but that's not the case. You have world leaders who are basically saying, look, this guy is just incredible. But what is also important here, Politico did a very interesting analysis. They interviewed several biographers of Donald Trump days before the inauguration, and basically what the biographers had a general conclusion that Trump's biggest fear is that he's not seen as a legitimate president by a majority of the people. And that's why he's so hung up on this crowd size and so forth.
Understood.
Yeah.
But Bankole, for a year and a half,
right,
he said this is going to be America first. He said it again in his inauguration address. I'm not sure that his supporters are all that concerned about whether the parliamentarians in England or the Prime Minister of Australia are all that in a wad about his behavior.
But that's true, Devin, but this nation is more than the sum total of his supporters.
Amen.
This nation is more than the sum total of his supporters. Look, Silicon Valley is being rattled right now as we speak. The chairman of Twitter is an American, but he was born in Iran. I mean, for goodness sake, seriously. I mean, so is our economy going to come to a collapse? Is that what we're rooting for?
Randy, when you've got the head of Uber saying, look, I got to bail out of these meetings because this is costing me too much money, too much goodwill with the clientele of Uber, that's not good business, is it?
Well, no, it's not good business, but I think this would have happened no matter who would have won the election. The people on the right and the people on the left are as upset with the other candidates as they can be. I think it's definitely an overreaction. The guy's been in office for less than 3 weeks, and we're already making decisions about what kind of job he's done, when he has done nothing but everything he said he would do so far. Give him the 100 days. He asked for 100 days. At least hold back and look and see if after the 100 days things start to happen the way that he said that they would, because I believe they will.
I don't think that CEO of Uber would be bowing out had there not been this immigration ban that came out last weekend. I think that really that's splitting the business community. It's putting people in a really difficult position. You know, you have Ford has been on a manufacturing council. GM's Mary Barra was there late this week. Met another picture right. He likes her right next to him, obviously. Every time I've seen her in a meeting with him, she's right next to him. I think it's going to put them in a difficult, sometimes in difficult positions, depending on the kind of policies that he takes and the approach that he takes. That is going to take some getting used to, and I think you're right. The thing I said to a couple of my colleagues is, can you really, as President of the United States, flout the Western democratic liberal order of doing things? There is a way in which governments do interact with each other, and heads of state interact with each other. And the other thing I would say about his base, he's not just a president of his base.
That's right.
He's the president. He said it. He said it on election night. He said, "I'm going to be president of all Americans." Well, then I would say, you know what? Fine, act like it. You know, you can pursue your policies, but you need to act like a president of the entire country.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's the thing. You've said you wanted at least one time to unify this country behind you. And certainly there's always going to be a loser and a winner in a presidential election, and losers have to get over it and start to move forward. But I have said, wait a minute, because I have said, I have always maintained that I have always respected the office of the president, and that even when it wasn't my candidate, he was my president. It wasn't my candidate anymore, it was my president, because I'm an American. There has been nothing that this president has done that has made me feel included in his America. And the things he does and the way he operates make me fearful. You say give him 100 days. The first 13 have been like the world exploding. I mean, this is craziness. We are hearing that he did nothing regarding policy around this ban. He told us after he called it a Muslim ban, and then they tried to pull it back. Call it a ban. I don't care what you call it. He doesn't have any idea what he's doing, and it's reflected in the way he operates, and we're stuck living with it.
Benkele, the immigration portion, you wrote a piece this past week called, I believe the title was "Jesus Was a Refugee."
Yeah.
You've taken great issue with the policy as well.
I have, because, you know, and my piece was targeted at the Christian evangelicals, the ones that are really supporting Trump, who are excited about his Supreme Court pick. Because I think when we look at history, you know, we all came from somewhere, whether it was African Americans who came here in 1619, Jamestown, or whether we came through, you know, Irish Americans came through Ellis Island. We all came from somewhere. This nation's strength is built on the undeniable fact that we are a nation of immigrants. I mean, in Silicon Valley, I mean, the strength of this nation, I mean, companies around the world.
You get the last 15 seconds, Sarah, before I get to it.
15 seconds?
That's yeah, try to get it all in.
I don't think, you talk about somebody losing and setting that aside. When you have 70-some senators and congressmen saying, I'm not even going to go to the inauguration, these are people that are supposed to be representing us, and that's their job. That's their job to be there. Let me finish. They should be docked for the pay if they can't even show up. I let you talk. I let you talk. So
refuse to allow him to do that.
They shouldn't be paid.
I promised you 15, you get 12. I got to take a quick break. We'll be back with more in just a minute. Because you took. I'm going to take you two out for brunch together. But just so, because we haven't gotten to everything, join us over on clickondetroit.com. We'll continue our conversation, including more on the Supreme Court notice. Meet the Press next. Have a great week. See you next time on Flashpoint.